Attempting to rise to the level of the Great Ones, the leading figures and institutions of Bloodborne appear to have been met with nothing but failure and ruin. A few creatures serve as living monuments to these disastrous efforts to achieve cosmic greatness. In this episode, we examine these strange beings and attempt to explain what they symbolize within the game's medical metaphor. Today, we join the experiment. I argued in episode 12b that the Great Ones resemble features found within the human body because they're supposed to represent the organs and systems that medical researchers, specifically surgeons and anatomists, would have only been able to see by gaining eyes on the inside, meaning a literal view into the human body. Rising to the level of the Great Ones, or elevating one's thoughts to those of a Great One, within the game's medical metaphor means gaining medical knowledge so that scholars and practitioners can understand the mysterious inner workings of the human body and master its physiology. If this interpretation is correct, then it seems to help us comprehend the other creatures that are commonly referred to in the lore community as either failed or manufactured Great Ones, or, as they're sometimes called, kin of the cosmos. Although there's much disagreement about what exactly constitutes kin and which creatures fall into this category. For that reason, and because of what we'll discuss today, I'm going to use another term throughout this video when referring to these bosses that don't seem to meet our established criteria for Great Ones. I'll refer to them as attempted Great Ones. In this episode, we'll try to answer two main questions, which are inextricably linked. What are these attempted Great Ones within the in-game lore, and how do they fit into the medical metaphor that we've followed throughout this series? To answer these questions, I think it's most helpful to start with the living failures. In order to adequately investigate these creatures, we need to first inspect the facility in which they were created. Just like we observed in episode 12b, when we noted that the so-called Tomb of the Gods was a path of research for Byrgenwerth's scholars and its tomb prospectors, the hospital facility overseen by Lady Maria was also a path of research, hence its name, the Research Hall. The implication is that this was a place of experimentation and study. We learn from the disturbing dialogue of the research patients and from the balcony key item description that Lady Maria was the primary caretaker of these people. We know from Maria's hunter attire that she was one of the first hunters and a student of the first hunter Gehrman, which leads us to believe that she and Gehrman were alive and active during the days of Byrgenwerth, prior to the establishment of the Healing Church. But there's a feature of the Research Hall that suggests that Maria was around long enough to become a leading figure in the Healing Church after Lawrence departed from Byrgenwerth to establish the church in the city of Yharnam. The signage throughout the Research Hall tells us the floor number and room names of several facilities within the hall. They all display the communion rune, which is virtually identical to the emblem of the Healing Church that we find on the Hunter Chief emblem and on the main gate of Cathedral Ward. This suggests that the Research Hall belonged to the Healing Church. Because the building is physically connected to the Grand Cathedral, which is the heart of the Healing Church, it makes it all the more likely that the Research Hall was the church's early testing ground. Much of what we can extract from the Research Hall comes from one NPC, the Blood Saint Adeline. Depicted as an overgrown brain in a bag and strapped securely to a restraining chair, Adeline has by far the most extensive dialogue of anyone in the Research Hall and sends us on a quest to retrieve a substance upon which she places great value: brain fluid. The description for one of the 3 brain fluid quest items helps us to see that the Healing Church, in its early days within the Research Hall, was trying to gain insight or eyes on the inside through the use of substances. The description states, "In the early days of the Healing Church, the Great Ones were linked to the ocean, and so the cerebral patients would imbibe water and listen for the howl of the sea. Brain fluid writhed inside the head, the initial makings of internal eyes." If internal eyes, or eyes on the inside, means a literal view into the human body, as we discussed in part 12b, then we can interpret this to mean that the brain fluid, which was the initial makings of internal eyes, is supposed to represent a substance given to patients that had intense neurological effects, and the doctors of the research hall were observing these effects on the patients to gain an understanding of brain function or the effect of certain substances on the brain. Adeline is clearly experiencing the painful symptoms of withdrawal and asks the player to bring her brain fluid, for which she will reward us. Based on the hypodermic syringe sticking out of her arm, the auditory hallucinations she's experiencing, and the intense feelings of euphoria she associates with brain fluid, it seems likely that Adeline and other research patients are being depicted as real-life patients who were incredibly high on psychoactive drugs, quite possibly heroin. Heroin was discovered in the mid-1800s, but it wasn't until the 1890s that the German pharmaceutical company Bayer commercially manufactured heroin. Bayer gave the drug heroin its name in honor of its heroically powerful pain-killing properties. The presence of bottles throughout the research hall labeled HCl, or hydrochloric acid, makes this heroin assumption slightly more plausible. Hydrochloric salts, derived from hydrochloric acid and an organic base, were used in the 1800s to synthesize morphine, and tetracetylmorphine diluted in hydrochloric acid is what produced heroin. But there's stronger evidence, I believe, that Adeline and the non-hostile research patients represent medical patients hooked on heroin. As Last Protagonist notes in his Japanese retranslations, when Adeline asks for brain fluid, the original Japanese includes a descriptive statement that's closer to darkly melted brain fluid. This description is very reminiscent of what's known as black tar heroin, a crude, coal-like version of the drug that's known for its dark brown or black color. And in almost all of her dialogue with the player, Adeline refers to the sticky sound of brain fluid, which matches the most distinctive physical feature of black tar heroin, its sticky, tar-like consistency. Heroin and morphine, both derived from opium, were prescribed in Europe and Great Britain in the late 1800s as pain relievers, and in the case of heroin, as a cough suppressant. These routine treatments were eventually banned in Europe and America because the substances were incredibly addictive, as we well understand today. What does this all mean for our understanding of the attempted or manufactured great ones? As we see in the research hall in the early years of the Healing Church, and as we observe with the other major institutions of Bloodborne, each organization wants to find a way to make contact with or to simply comprehend the Great Ones. To do so, they need eyes on the inside. Although that was a shared aim of all the institutions of Bloodborne, their approaches weren't always the same. The early work of the Healing Church within the research hall meant giving patients this highly addictive, mind-altering substance. Brain fluid transformed patients from normal human beings into these bag-headed monstrosities who lost their grip on reality. They babble and wander aimlessly, they scream and thrash around, they speak of noises of water and talk about becoming an egg. Their dialogue and the description of brain fluid imply that the research hall was giving brain fluid to these patients to help them evolve or advance, but it didn't work, at least not as planned. As the exasperated research patient confesses to an absent Lady Maria just before we exit the research hall, "I have failed." The research patients didn't evolve to become great ones. The patients that underwent the most radical transformation as a result of their exposure to brain fluid became merely living failures, or failed attempts to evolve into great ones. This is what the bosses associated with each major institution in the game represent: attempts to use their own method of research to evolve or advance humanity to the status of great ones. Whereas the living failures were brought about by exposure to this strange brain fluid substance, which was administered in a medical capacity in a hospital-like research hall, Rom was Bergenworth's attempt to do so, I believe by using pharmaceutical substances in the form of botanics. This is why I've argued Byrgenwerth appears so tightly bound with the nervous system, and why we see visual depictions of mushrooms and flowers on Master Willem. We also know from the choir set that the choir, the highest echelon of the Healing Church, continued the work that began at Byrgenwerth. The choir's realm is Upper Cathedral Ward, and its version of an attempted Great One is the Celestial Emissary, which can be found within the Lumen Flower Garden, another reference to botanics and the pharmaceuticals derived from them. It's no mistake that the living failures of the research hall look like a hybrid of the research patients and the celestial minions we find throughout the game. The failures were the most transformed of the research hall patients and contain their bag-like heads, but their bodies resemble those of the celestial minions and celestial emissary, which were a much later and presumably much more refined or advanced attempt at using experimental medicinal substances to force humanity to evolve. Thanks to our discovery of the celestial minions on the operating tables in the back of Yosefka's clinic, including one that's only partially transformed and still displays a human hand, we know that these creatures are humans who have been transformed by exposure to substances that were administered in a medical capacity. Unlike the living failures, the celestial emissary, and Rom, all of whom appear to have been transformed by the use of brain-altering substances, the One Reborn is the school of Mensis' attempt at a Great One, which takes the form of a fusion of bodies and body parts whose rotten flesh has been peeled away. As I discussed in episodes 5 and 12b, Mensis is an organization depicting the anatomists of the early 1800s who carved up dead bodies for medical research. With all of this in mind, I think we can draw some conclusions. Each institution in the game represents a snapshot in time of medical science, and when viewed chronologically in the game, they represent the evolution of medical science from the late 1700s to the late 1800s. Each institution has its own method of trying to gain insight or eyes on the inside, and we're led to believe that each organization attempted to create a Great One using their unique method. For the Healing Church, Byrgenwerth, and the choir, it meant using powerful and addictive substances, be they psychotropic botanics or the heroin-like brain fluid. These methods of gaining insight and attempting to create a Great One reflect the real-life medical research practices of the pre-Victorian and Victorian era, mainly the development and administration of new medications, anesthetics, and narcotics, and in the case of Mensis, the widespread practice of anatomical dissection. It seems reasonable that a group depicting the anatomists of the early 1800s would use this method of medical research in their attempt to manufacture a Great One, the One Reborn, which is a nightmarish amalgamation of body parts, mainly the sinewy, skinless limbs of cadavers. In my interpretation, the real Great Ones are the creatures that resemble internal features of the human body, representing the internal organs and systems that surgeons and anatomists would have discovered during surgery and dissection. By contrast, From Software appears to have used the failed or attempted Great Ones as a means of representing humanity's real-life desire to gain mastery over the human body using many methods of medical research. But no such method could ever truly bring humanity's knowledge of the human body up to a level at which we would have such mastery. Pharmaceuticals and anatomical dissection only grant so much medical insight. Alone, or maybe even together, they're not enough to deliver humanity to a higher plane of knowledge. But the hubris, pretentiousness, and naivety of the game's leading figures has them convinced that they can indeed match the greatness of the Great Ones, so the effort continues generation after generation, failure after failure. In the next and final episode, we conclude the series, and I'll put forth an argument about the origin of the medical metaphor. Although it's rooted in real-life Victorian medicine, this element is far more nightmarish and disturbing than anything we've discussed so far. It seems all too appropriate for what we observe in the game.